7 common misconceptions about the moon. For today, the moon is the most studied solar system body we know so far. However, it's surprising how many myths and wrong understanding here about the moon. Although we know the most about the moon, we studied it for longest time, numerous research crafts and even people landed on the moon. In general public, there's still a lot of myths and misconceptions about our satellite. Let's talk about 7 main misconceptions in this video and try to understand, is it true or not, what people believe. First very common misconception about the moon is quite interesting one. It's that the moon is empty. And it's interesting because this legend comes from real studies that have been performed on the moon, and there's some basis behind it. When first explorers start landing on the moon, automatic robots and people, the first seismographers was installed on the surface of the moon, and they start recording the seismic waves of the moon, similar like we do on our Earth. By doing that, we can understand the interior of the planet, which type of medium there, and by the frequency, duration, speed of the waves that coming through the Earth and reflected and recorded by seismographers, we can understand is there a liquid core, is there a core, is there a mantle, and approximately density of the moon, and so forth. However, there was astonishing results that all seismographers that collected and still collecting the data from the moon, they show that the moon vibrating much longer than we would expect. Thus, compare this with our Earth, the vibration on the moon, the waves that penetrate through the moon, last longer in 10 times or more. We call those vibrations caused by the moonquakes, similar like on our Earth, earthquakes, or from collision, for example, when some kind of asteroids fall down on the planet, they were called the shock wave coming through the whole body, and seismographers were recorded. People start thinking, so there must be nothing inside of the moon if the moon, like a huge bell, keep ringing after you shake it once. It's very interesting, very intriguing, and numerous theories come out from there that there is a secret base inside of the moon, it's just empty, or something else about it, like the moon was made artificially. However, everything that this shows us, and this is real scientific results about this prolonger moonquakes duration, only shows that there's a different composition of the moon than, for example, of our Earth. And it's not surprising, the moon doesn't have a thick atmosphere like we do, doesn't have a strong magnetic field like we do, and therefore the interior of the moon will be different from us. It's also come from the understanding how the moon was formed. One of my previous videos we talked about this, that the moon supposedly was formed, according to modern scientists, collision on the first stage of formation of our Earth with some other body, size of the Mars, and from this material that was crushed, brought from our Earth and from this other body, around our orbit formed the moon. Everything we can say from that this vibration, this prolonged vibration of the moon, could be caused by very dry material within the moon and more uniform inside, rather than very different in our planet with a lot of molten lava and active core. Second very interesting misconception, where people confused about the phases of the moon. So simple, so understandable for many of us, there's still a lot of people who not really understand why we see the phases of the moon. Is it the shadow of the Earth causing the phases of the moon, or something else? So let's understand why we see the phases of the moon. The phases of the moon we see just because the light reflected from its surface differently. Any body in our solar system reflects the light from the sun. So the sun generates the light. It's the star which producing the light by atomic reaction within. And the size of the sun is so huge in comparison with any other bodies in our solar system that it shines on everything. Just like a light bulb in the middle of the room, put its light on every object in the room. But other side of the object will always have the shadow, and in the dark space it's quite pronounced. And if you look on any body in our solar system from side, so the sun, for example, will be from the left, object to the right, because of the shape of the object, the sunlight will be cast only on one side of the object, and the other side will be dark. But because most of our objects in the solar system rotate around themselves, for example like Earth, we have days and nights. Therefore our planet one side which faced away from the sun always dark, but for us it's constantly changing every 24 hours. And that's how day-night comes. Absolutely the same applies to the moon. Moon have day side and a night side, because moon rotates around its own axis. And when it's rotates around the sun with us, because it rotates around us first and we rotate around the sun, similar, the sun will put the light on one side. But why we see the phases? Because we are involved in this rotation mechanism. The moon rotates and around itself, creating day and night on the moon, around our planet, and our planet rotates around the sun. It just happened that the day and night on the moon coincides with the rotation of the moon around our Earth. Therefore, we happen to see the constantly almost one side of the moon facing towards us. Because of that phenomena, we can observe these phases within the months. The months, 29.5 days, that's how long it takes for the moon to rotate around our Earth. However, the moon is rotating itself around itself, its own axis, and it's experienced day and night on both sides of the moon all the time. Therefore, we see new moon. We see that side of the moon which at the night, that time. Then we see crescent moon, just one side of the moon which face towards us and under the light of the sun. Then we see half moon, full moon. When the moon is in opposition to us, it's at the back and the full sunlight cast on the moon surface, and so on. We'll come back to the new moon again, when the moon will be closer to the sun, and we will be from distant side of the moon to the sun, and we'll see the dark side. Similar, if you, for example, observing an Earth from the moon, you will as well see our whole side of the Earth if the moon was between the sun and the Earth during the day, or you would see half shined Earth if you were 90 degrees towards our Earth in comparison with the sun, and you will see the dark side of our Earth if you're in opposition. Many people confused that the phases are because of the shadow of our Earth cast on the moon. No, it has nothing to do with that. In any phase of the moon, for example half moon or full moon, you can observe the lunar eclipse when the shadow of the Earth will partially or fully cast on the moon. And that leads us to the next misconception about lunar eclipses. Why we don't see them every time when the Earth passes between the moon and the sun? And the answer will be because the orbit of the moon around Earth is tilted as well, similar like our orbit is tilted towards the sun. There's only particular times when some parts of our Earth can observe the shadow which comes from the Earth towards the moon. And you can observe it as well in a particular part of the planet, partially or fully. Quite interesting. Full eclipse of the moon happened just recently, observed in Pacific Ocean in Oceania. That time the moon was full and it was the best time to observe the lunar eclipse, and impressively nice weather was in favor. However, when we observed it, we didn't see fully blacked moon from the Earth's shadow, because the Earth have an atmosphere and the light tend to curved, especially if it's distorted by the atmosphere. And if you think about the light coming from the sun, it's much more overwhelming than the Earth size, diameter. Therefore, even in a full moon eclipse, you still see some shadow, darker or more bloody red color of the moon cast on its surface. Will be this refraction of the light through the Earth's atmosphere. From here comes the next misconception about the brightness of the moon. First of all, the moon doesn't produce any light. Everything we see on the surface of the moon that shines, it will be the sunlight that is reflected. And surprisingly, the moon is not actually a very bright object. It's as bright as the surface of the black book. Its refraction index much lower than, for example, for our Earth. Why? Moon doesn't have rich atmosphere at all. So only the dusty surface, that's the only thing that reflects the light. The light reflected only 10% of the light from sun casting on the moon. In comparison, for the Earth, we have a lot of clouds, water vapor, and thick layer of atmosphere, and our Earth reflects up to 35% of sunlight that comes towards the Earth. Therefore, if you will observe the Earth from the moon or any other space object, you will see quite bright, beautiful planet. However, we still see in the full moon, day and night, very bright moon. Why? It's all about the contrast and the optical illusion. When you look in the dark sky and there's only one object like moon, which is quite close to us, shines bright, reflecting the sunlight, it seems very bright. And in comparison with the stars, which are quite distant from us, and the light of them dispersed in a thick atmosphere of our Earth, moon seems so shiny and bright. However, we call it cold light, the reflected light. It's not produced light, that's why you don't feel the heat coming from the moonlight. The sun otherwise can burn your skin, warm up the objects on the surface of the planet, and it's absolutely incomparable, the light from the moon with the light coming from the sun during the day. Let's talk about the color of the moon. People think the color of the moon is gray. However, again, talking about the previous misconception, it's come from understanding that this is the optical illusion. We see the moon at night and only refracted light. If you turn off all light at home during the night and you walk around the room, I don't think you will differentiate the colors as well of your walls, furniture, carpets in your house. It will all seem to you kind of similar, darkish grayish color. Even if there will be some dispersed light from the street lights, you still will see everything kind of grayish in your room. It will be hard to pick up pencil. Is it blue or green? Similar, we see the moon. Moon reflected the light. She is very dark in a dark sky in the middle of the night. Therefore, this reflected light seems to be white and or grayish of color. It doesn't mean that composition and rocks that on the surface of the moon are of that color or that one composition. Scientists who study the geology of the moon, they actually have a lot of images which reflect the true color, so-called, of the moon's surface, and you can see it's quite rich and have different colors depending on lithology, composition, minerals they preserve on its surface. One more misconception, it's about one side of the moon which we can see. We can see only the half of the moon. And also some people call the other side of the moon dark side. People call it dark side on the other side of the moon, as we already talked about in the phases of the moon, not because the moon is always not shined by the light on other side. No, it's shined by the light through its rotation around its own axis within 29.5 days. Similar like our Earth, have equally sun on both sides of the sphere. However, people start calling other side of the moon dark because before we went there into the space and photographed it from other side, we couldn't see it. So similar like people called dark ages. In medieval history, dark ages, it's mean they're kind of unknown and rather suspicious and scary, rather than dark in terms of color. So when you hear people talking about dark side of the moon, it doesn't mean she's dark in terms of light. It means she's dark, people know her less. And before last 100 years, we have sending spacecraft to the space. We didn't know how does it look at all. However, it's interesting that we don't see the exactly half of the moon all the time. We see a little bit more from both sides of this half of the moon. If you look on the image recorded through the night, because we rotate on our planet from one side to the other, and the moon rotates as well slowly, we can see a little bit to the one side of the back of the moon and a little bit to the other side. Kind of like effects of parallax. Watch my video of parallax. We change the distance between 2 points and we can see a little bit wider of the object we observe. In astronomy, they call it libration of the moon, and you can see that the moon a little bit swing on the way. It's come closer to the Earth and swing from one side to side. And it's all because of the eclipse orbit of the moon around an Earth. It's not perfect circle, and also because of the tilt of the moon towards our axis, it's about 7. Therefore, sometimes we see a little bit of the southern hemisphere of the moon more, sometimes a little bit of the northern hemisphere more. Next time you're observing the moon through the night, when it's a full moon, just notice or photograph it and see the difference. And the last interesting misconception about the moon, which I would like to talk about, a little bit fun one. People say, when we observe the moon in a telescope or strong telescope or nice binocular, we still don't see evidence of people landed on the surface. Well, if we don't see the evidence, it might mean that nobody went there. It was all legend and conspiracy. Nobody ever landed on the moon. However, there's an interesting explanation why we cannot see the very small objects on the surface of the moon from the Earth. And it's very simple. We're observing the moon from the Earth's surface. And when you're on the Earth's surface, above you, there's not just a space, empty space, and the moon, boom, you can see it. No, you have several kilometers of Earth's atmosphere. Earth's atmosphere is very dynamic. It has a lot of dust, aerosols, water vapor, and so on, constantly mixing in our atmosphere. People observing the desert sand coming from Sahara across the ocean. We can observe the rainforest fire moving across the Pacific Ocean. We observe the dust coming from Australia deserts to the New Zealand mountain caps. Therefore, can imagine how saturated our atmosphere, not just with the dust, but also with the water. Scientists suggested if we compacted all the thickness of our atmosphere above your head into the small layer, you will have 10 meters of the water above your head. If you imagine you dive into the 10 meters deep pool and you're trying to look on a night sky, what are you going to see? You're not even going to see much the people who are standing by the pool and watching down towards you. That's what we see through our telescope and binoculars on the surface of the moon. Therefore, to observe the footsteps and other smaller objects on the surface of the moon, like left aircraft and so on, you should use the telescope outside of the orbit of our planet, outside of our atmosphere. Even on the space stations, which right now rotates around our orbit, we're still within the atmosphere of our Earth, high levels, but there's still distortion. Therefore, you need to really take the telescope outside of our atmosphere and observe very, very fine objects on the surface. Therefore, when you're trying to zoom in closer and closer, even with the very sophisticated computers, binoculars, or telescope on our surface of the Earth, even in the high mountains, you're still gonna see distortion and couldn't differentiate small objects. Therefore, we cannot claim that there is nothing in the moon just because we don't see it.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I hope you enjoyed this fun misconception about the moon. There are obviously much more exist. Moon, one of the most intriguing and speculated subject in astronomy, just because it's so close to us, and we spiritually bound to this. And of course, we're very worried where it's come from, what it's made of, and we're trying to create a lot of myth and legends about that. I hope it's become a little bit clear about the moon, what you see and why, and I will see you in my next videos.